maryland.gov.
State Circle is made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you.
Legislators tried to delay a new sick leave law.
They just can't get it together to get it implemented in time.
Both the businesses and the employees the time to understand what this legislation really is.
Calls for better follow-up in child endangerment cases.
Intended to kill herself and kill her children.
And a bid to settle a decade-long legal fight.
I'm very happy that the governor has indicated a willingness to reach a final settlement.
Connecting Marylanders to their government. This is State Circle.
Good evening. The big story around State Circle this week, the new sick leave law, which is set to take effect Sunday. That's despite a vote by the state Senate to give employers more time to prepare. Charles Robinson has details.
I came back here, as some of you know, from shock trauma in a blood-stained suit to cast my 29th vote, right? My wife said, go to Annapolis, be number 29, make sure that people have sick leave.
The clock to implement the mandatory earned paid sick leave law is ticking. It's supposed to go into effect on Sunday. The legislature overrode the governor's veto at the beginning of the session. The new law allows low-end workers to stockpile hours to use in emergencies. As people begin to dive into how it works, it is clear things are going to be complicated.
I've gotten so many calls from small businesses in my area that are saying that they just can't get it together to get it implemented in time to do the right thing. They're feeling that they don't even have time to keep track of it from now, even if we do that. So I'm just saying I go along with the paid sick leave, but I really think we have to do it right.
Senate Bill 304 would give employers a reprieve until July 1st. A last-minute amendment to allow workers to collect credits immediately failed.
The majority of businesses don't even know. The governor was giving them false hope, I believe, that he was going to get a bill through, so they weren't taking the steps to get ready. They were holding out hope.
That gives, one, the Department of Labor an opportunity to put regs together, but more importantly, gives both the businesses and the employees the time to understand what this legislation really is, what this policy will be, and it was a much-needed break.
The Senate bill will now go to the House, and there is no guarantee it will be taken up.
And Charles tells us the House did adjourn for the weekend without taking up the Senate bill. Lawmakers are considering changes to the state's child protection laws, requiring more active follow-up to reports of child endangerment, as Nancy Amata reports.
This legislation will help us to save the lives of children who are defenseless.
Prince George's County State's Attorney Angela Also Brooks makes an impassioned plea before the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee for a bill that she says could have saved 4 children from the hands of their mothers.
This bill, as you have heard already, started with Sonia Spoon, who made a threat, said she intended to kill herself and kill her children. Her mother did everything in her power to protect her, had her involuntarily committed, called the police. What we failed to do, however, was to send officials into that home to make sure that the children were safe.
Days later, she followed through with her threat and killed her 1-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter. After another similar case, Also Brooks says she's determined to close a legal loophole.
If you threaten to hurt or kill your child, there is no requirement that the Department of Family Services go to the home to check on children.
Under Senate Bill 584, social services would be required to do an investigation, even if only a threat were made. Senator Victor Ramirez is the sponsor of the bill.
We all realize there's mental health issues, substance abuse issues, depression, and sometimes if we can be proactive when we hear things and contact the proper, whether it's social services or law enforcement, to take the proper steps to avoid anyone from being harmed, I think it's a good thing.
But opponents say this bill, while good in theory, may trigger unwarranted investigations and could cause huge problems for families where children are not actually in harm's way.
Investigations are anonymous in the state of Maryland. That information is never revealed. So you don't know who's making those reports against you. They could be malicious, they could be false.
Vanita Taylor is with the Maryland Office of the Public Defender.
We're allowing anyone's words, whether they are benign or whatever, but the mere words to be used against a parent to trigger an investigation.
Her arguments were not lost on at least one senator.
This is kind of a big leap in the law, and a big change, because we're going from a standard of they shall report abuse to basically having people report risk of abuse.
Proponents point out there are no criminal penalties tied to this bill, merely an obligation to protect the state's most vulnerable from possible abuse. I'm Nancy Yamada for State Circle.
The Women's Legislative Caucus has officially issued 22 recommendations to prevent and root out sexual harassment at the state legislature. The 60-member caucus is recommending more in-depth training for lawmakers to identify what constitutes harassment, and they want to implement a better system of reporting after some victims came forward and said they worry about retaliation.
We hire an independent sexual harassment specialist who understands how to do these things, and that they work with an independent investigator to investigate these claims. We're recommending that we increase the number of people that you can file a report with so that you can go to someone that you feel comfortable with to file the report.
The caucus hopes to draft some of their recommendations into law. Other ideas will be forwarded to a newly formed commission examining the legislature's policies on sexual harassment. Governor Hogan went under the dermatologist's knife this week for some common forms of skin cancer. He says it's the result of years of lifeguarding as a young man before sunscreen was widely used. The governor went on to appear at a Maryland Dermatologic Society skincare screening event. Meanwhile, this week, House Speaker Michael Bush honored the doctors who gave him a new lease on life with a liver transplant. Doctors from the University of Maryland Medical Center performed the surgery. His sister donated a portion of her liver. The Speaker is backing a bill to give a tax credit to future organ donors to offset expenses, including lost wages. Well, the health crisis that is opioid abuse is the focus of a special series of programs on MPT. Tonight at 9:30, we're teaming up with the PBS NewsHour for a close look at the problem here in Maryland and across the nation.
We've seen over time that the epidemic really has shifted from primarily what was prescription opioids, and there is some still of that, but now it's definitely being driven, particularly here in Maryland and other states, by heroin and fentanyl. And fentanyl really has been kind of a big game changer. And, you know, part of it is that people may not necessarily be ready for treatment, or they may not think that they really need treatment. It also, sometimes we make it difficult to access treatment.
Join us tonight at 9:30 for our one-hour special America Addicted. Well, Governor Hogan this week proposed a compromise in a legal case that has been grinding along for 12 years. Supporters of the state's historically black colleges initially sued for greater state support. 4 years ago, a federal judge found the state was perpetuating segregation by housing the most popular programs at other state schools. The governor is now offering $100 million in new funding to settle the issue.
I'm very happy that the governor has indicated a willingness to reach a final settlement agreement on the HBCU's lawsuit. I don't know how far we can go with his settlement offer. It all depends on the details.
The historically black institutions are Morgan, Coppin, Bowie, and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Now in their third year, members of Maryland's Latino caucus are looking for input from the community as they develop their legislative priorities. Yolanda Vasquez has more.
It's very important, particularly in this political climate in the country, that people be engaged in their government.
House Speaker Michael Bush set the tone for the third annual Legislative Latino Caucus as a veritable who's who of lawmakers and local leaders share how their work has impacted Maryland's Hispanic community.
1 year ago, I had the honor to stand here and denounce the rise of bigotry and hatred that was taking over this country and also this state.
And we've sued him for stopping the DACA program.
We've sued him to protect all Americans' rights to health care, women's rights to choose contraception, which they're trying to stop.
Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby spoke of doubling the size of her victim witness unit, adding in Spanish-speaking advocates.
Because we understand and we recognize that there is a fear, and rightfully so, under this federal administration, with coming forward and participating in the criminal justice process.
The annual event provides an opportunity for community organizations to educate the 6-member panel, who will serve as an effective voice in developing public policy.
And so for us, it becomes an opportunity as we sit in our hearings and we look at legislation that's coming in from all different angles to say, you know what, here are some priorities that the community has brought back to us, and we want to make sure that we're getting that input as legislation gets crafted here in Annapolis.
Delegate Carlos Sanchez is chair of the caucus. He says the Latino population is growing in Maryland and should have strong representation statewide.
And really leading into the 2018 election, it's important that we be able to keep our representative numbers at least level, if not gain a couple people.
More than 24 presenters briefed the caucus of their legislative priorities, and the issues were wide-ranging. Everything from the expansion of the DREAM Act to how law enforcement officials interact with immigrant communities. Odette Ramos, who works for a community organization, attended the event to push for a bill that will help preserve affordable housing.
There are lots of housing units that have been subsidized, where their subsidies are going to run out in 2020. That's 35% in the state, and that's a problem.
She, like many others, hope her pleas to improve the quality of life for Maryland's Latino community will be heard by the very people who will also advocate on their behalf. In Annapolis, I'm Yolanda Vasquez for State Circle.
Joining us for this week's Annapolis Face-Off, Delegate Christian Mealy, a Republican from Baltimore County, and Senator Cheryl Kagan, a Democrat from Montgomery County. Thanks to both of you for being with us.
Happy to
Thanks
be
for
here.
having us. Delegate Mealy, you're one of the sponsors of a bill to provide for term limits for members of the legislature. How would that work?
Well, there are a number of proposals that have been introduced by both members of the legislature as well as the governor. One of the proposals would require or would limit legislators in the General Assembly to 2 terms, and then they would have to either run for another office or just return to their private lives and professions. There's another proposal floating around that would allow a legislator, after serving 2 consecutive terms, to sit out a term and then return later. They can then seek office after that waiting period.
What's the reason for these bills?
Well, I think we've come to a time where it's important to infuse the legislature with new ideas and a fresh way of thinking, particularly on ideas and areas like redistricting reform and reapportionment. We have a scheme in Maryland right now where Marylanders do not have fair representation across the board in the House of Delegates. Some Marylanders have 1 representative and 1 voice in the House, some have 2, and others have 3. And I don't think that that's ever going to be addressed unless we get some new people down here to make that a priority for them.
Senator Kagan, how do you feel about it?
Strongly disagree with my friend and colleague here. First off, this is a solution in search of a problem. 62% of the current members of the House of Delegates, including Delegate Mealy, are in their first 2 terms. And so they are already limiting themselves either by retiring, running for other office, or being defeated. I ran against a 32-year incumbent and lost, actually. So sometimes people like what they have. It was narrowly lost, but I believe in democracy, and we should make sure that that they have that option. One other thing, the people who support term limits are often pretty cynical about lobbyists. If we have term-limited legislators, lobbyists are going to be the ones who are making a disproportionate impact. Lobbyists and staff are behind the scenes, and they are not accountable to the voters. I think that's a problem.
Delegate Mealy, let me get you to respond to that, but also
Sure.
Your expectations for whether this is going anywhere, because I think it may require a supermajority and a voter referendum.
Sure. Yeah, I don't believe that this will be addressed by the legislature. I think that's that's a real issue. Some of these issues which are overwhelmingly supported by Marylanders, such as fair redistricting and free and fair elections and reapportionment reform, a bill I've introduced this year to address the issue I talked about earlier, are widely supported. And I think unless we get, like I said, and I do support a hybrid model. Let me be clear about that. In the hybrid model, which we have in the state of Florida, you can serve 2 terms, sit out a term. It rotates the door so that new voices can enter the legislature, and then veteran lawmakers can return. So you'll have a mix of seasoned elected officials as well as new lawmakers. And again, we're trying to infuse the legislature with new ideas and actually to do what's right by the people, not the politicians.
One thing you have not brought up, Delegate, is corruption, which was the governor's rationale for supporting this idea. You talked about fresh ideas. Is there an anti-corruption argument to it?
I actually have a bill called the Clean Up Annapolis Act, which says that you would forfeit your pension if you use your office of public trust for personal profit or gain, and any per diem that you use between the time of your indictment and later conviction has to be paid back to the taxpayer. So we're focused on government ethics reform as well.
Senator, I'm sorry, you were trying to jump in?
That's all right. I think mushing together questions of ethics and question of redistricting is just a weird confluence of topics. The Conservative Heritage Foundation found that in states with term limits, there is a disproportionate increase in fundraising and special interests, because after you win election to your second term, all bets are off. There's no accountability. You get 4 years of a free ride in fundraising, in questionable ethics, and in terms of special interests. I can't imagine that's what Marylanders would want.
And I would agree with the senator. I don't think we should conflate government ethics and corruption with the term limits issue. I think we should bifurcate the 2 issues and treat them separately. They're both equally important, though.
It's such an interesting issue, even if it's not going anywhere, because it really gets to the heart of how a citizen legislature works. How long would you say it took from when you landed in Annapolis till you felt like you knew what you were doing as a legislator?
Is that posed to me
either.
As the freshman? I would say about 2 to 3 years where you actually learn how the legislative process works, how to build coalitions to get things done. So I think that's why the hybrid model would be my preference, because again, you have a mix of seasoned legislators who have that institutional knowledge of how the legislature works, as well as some new voices who can, who aren't jaded by being here for too long.
I believe in democracy. I believe in new voices, but I think the voters should be able to pick, not some random rule. We wouldn't do this in terms of football players that are doing super work on our teams. Why would we do that for people who are being effective in the legislature?
I think the senator raises a good point. I think campaign finance is something we need to seriously look at and address. Because a lot of these veteran lawmakers continue to get elected, even though they won't vote in the best interest of the people they represent in some of these cases, I think the corrupting influence of money in politics does, because a lot of these incumbents do have substantially more money than would-be challengers. I think that's another issue that's at least tangentially related to term limits and to not moving the ball forward on some of these issues that are widely supported by Marylanders.
Again, term limits means more fundraising, more special interest money, and more of an influence by lobbyists and staff.
Senator Kagan, Delegate Mealy, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
And we're back with the Political Roundtable right after this.
Are you turning 70 and a half this year? If so, you generally have to start spending down your retirement account. Even the minimum distribution can place you in a sticky situation. Luckily, you can now use your IRA to make tax-free gifts. Gifts up to $100,000 will never count as income, but always make a difference. That's icing on the cake.
Make your gift for this year before December 31st. Visit mpt.org/support.
This is a box that showed you a world beyond your own. It was just a box, but the world has changed, and so have we. And now the box can be almost any size or shape. And you decide what you want to explore. Anytime, any place. Break out of the box with PBS.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood.
We are the curious.
Wow!
the adventurous,
those venturing out for the first time,
and those who've never lost our sense of wonder. You seeing this?
we are the hungry,
The strong,
I must be the greatest, the joyful.
A happy little cloud.
We believe there is always more we can uncover.
More we can explore.
We believe in the capacity for goodness
And the potential for greatness.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
PBS.
PBS.
Back to the State House now, where Charles Robinson is joined by Len Lazaruk of MarylandReporter.com. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. There was an executive order from the governor's office this afternoon about juvenile offenders. What was that about?
Well, it was a reaction to a Supreme Court ruling in June of 2012 where juveniles could no longer be charged with life without parole. And the governor has decided that he's going to do it on a case-by-case basis to decide whether or not you meet a certain particulars in order to be moved into parole category. Understand this, the governor has a very big crime bill that is dealing with violent offenders. He doesn't want to let people out. He wants to keep them behind bars to protect communities.
Yeah, but he has the authority on his own without going through the legislature to release people and take a look at it on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's really the core of the Supreme Court ruling. Correct?
That's right. And the other part is, to date, he's only released 2 people who were juveniles who had life sentences, and there is one other whose sentence was commuted to just life as opposed to life without parole.
So let's try to explain what's next on sick leave. This law, as we mentioned, as Charles, you reported at the top of the show, since the governor's veto was overridden, takes effect 30 days later. That's Sunday. So when the new work week starts, a lot of people who didn't used to have that benefit will. The Senate voted to delay it to give companies more time to get their HR systems ready. The House has not acted. But I noticed that the House scheduled a hearing on the Senate's bill on Tuesday. What do you think's going on?
I think they're just going through the motions. If there was any interest in the House to actually move this, they could have scheduled an immediate hearing. The fact that it got delayed in the Senate, it actually got delayed in the Senate. It was voted on last Friday, and it seemed like they wanted to move it quickly, but then it didn't finally pass until yesterday, and no expectation that the House, I mean, the business interests that have been lobbying this fully expected after the delay in the Senate that it was just going to go into effect. I can't see how the House is going to come back a week or 2 after it goes into effect, and they're going to say, oh, wait a minute, we're going to delay for another 4 months.
And
right,
and the other part of that is that people wanted to say, let the clock start ticking now. And that was kind of defeated in the Senate. And that was kind of like, well, let the House deal with this in whichever way. So it's going to go to House Economic Matters, and we'll see what happens on Tuesday.
And in the Senate, they even talked about, well, the House could amend it and then send it back. We're talking about 2 or 3 weeks. Businesses are having a hard time to figure this out. Part of the problem is that a lot of businesses, even small businesses, use software that is not fully adapted to what the new system might be. So there's going to be a rough period of implementation.
Len, you reported on MarylandReporter.com about the prospects for people being able to, over the internet, look in on live debates on the floor of the House of Delegates in the state Senate where you are standing. That was a priority for the governor this year. Any movement?
I don't expect to see any movement, but I was disappointed in the Senate hearing because I thought the governor has been pushing this, and basically the Senate president and the House Speaker are not real enthusiastic about it, and the governor sent a relatively new legislative aide. I didn't even recognize the person, and as a matter of fact, Senator Conway, the committee chair, asked her to pronounce her name, so she knew what to call her. The League of Women Voters didn't show up. They wrote to me afterwards. I actually added to the story yesterday. We weren't aware of this, and I think it's going to come eventually.
Hey, Len, before we go, I want to give you a chance to talk about this. We all know there's a very powerful state board, the Board of Public Works. There's a new organization you're involved with, the Bar of Public Works, in a sentence. Tell me about that fundraiser.
Well, we have our annual happy hour at Harry Brown's, and this year I'm calling it the Bar of Public Works because I have all three members, the governor, the comptroller, and the state treasurer, as guest bartenders. Nancy Kopp, the state treasurer, said she always wanted to be a bartender.
We're going to have to leave it there. We'll see more information at MarylandReporter.com. Len, Charles, have a good weekend. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in for State Circle. We're back Monday with Direct Connection. Have a good night.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.
Artworks is MPT's weekly on-air arts salon.
My motivation is a very personal one.
Get the insider track on artists from across the country and the world.
Our artists are an eclectic group of creative minds.
Discover our area's diverse artists, musicians, and writers.
Our village was a repository of dreams.
Join Rhea Fiken and her local co-hosts every week on Artworks. Tonight at 7:30 on MPT.
You're watching member-supported Maryland Public Television.
To hear the stories that come with the names, it's a wonderful investigation of how I came to be.
The past is also part of the present.
Let us save our national honor.
You believed in what